All right, serious question. Where is reality? We're so busy talking about what reality is, we haven't even settled where reality is. Now, before you think I'm talking crazy here, let me explain a little bit more of what I'm talking about. I want you to think about how strange reality is, what we really take for granted every day. What remains when all of your senses are gone and you can no longer perceive anything? Does reality continue to exist independently, or does it simply vanish? This image on the right is a great depiction of what reality can look like once we've settled a lot of our verbal thoughts and mental activity. It sort of looks like someone is looking out of their own body. They're separate from their own body. What they see is that their body and environment are all merged as one. Now, on the other side, we just see a picture of a sagittal view, sagittal brain. And from this perspective, we think of the brain as producing reality. It is quite literally creating the reality that we see. So, what's the perspective here? Where is the reality? Is reality something that's being created by our brain? Is reality something that our brain is just interpreting? Well, the answer is actually not quite as clear as one would assume. As we'll talk about later within science, the common perspective is that reality exists independent of the observer, and the observer is just taking in a small amount of data and using that to construct their own reality. One perspective here is solipsism, or brain in the vat, which people may or may not have heard of. If you haven't heard of these before, solipsism is essentially the notion that one's mind can be the only thing that truly exists. So in this sense, we might think that the reality that we perceive, it's a creation of our brain, and we can't really know anything to exist independently of our brain. So we say that reality is within our brain, it's within our head, and we can't really turn to anything outside as having a definitive take on what reality is. It's just more so a projection. Now, that really gets into an unfalsifiable territory, especially when we see that solipsism doesn't have much explanatory power, primarily because it's running on unfalsifiable assumptions. Now, on the other hand, I think most people would say that they see a flower here. We could also argue that they're just a meaningful organization of different colored dots, and that appears as a flower to our brain because our brain is taking in certain visual cues, visual processing, many different steps are involved, and it is telling us that there's a flower in front of us. We really have to slow down, take a step back, and reevaluate to consider from the perspective that, hey, there's just a bunch of different dots here. Again, this is getting more so towards the view that's supported by science, which is essentially that there are stimuli. Those can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on how someone's nervous system is structured. And based on how that nervous system is structured, they might see certain things. A bee might look at the same flower and see things in ultraviolet. They can see colors that we can't see, and so on. In short, we really don't know for sure what the true answer is. However, if we're going with the evidence, and I would say what makes the most logical sense, it would be that reality as it is exists independently of us. We exist within reality. That's probably a better way to think about it. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. The contents of reality, you can't really equate that to reality in its truest sense. This is a similar argument to what we see in terms of the contents and states of consciousness. You can't really equate those to consciousness alone, but they're more like manifestations of consciousness. Same idea with reality and its contents. A quick example here, we might think of a video game, and everything you see in the video game, the character you're playing, the enemies, the dragon in this case, the background, all of the scenery, well, that boils down to scripts, right? Scripts and code. Those we could argue are more fundamental in terms of what reality is, and then what we see through the game when we're observing it as the reality is panning out, those are more of the contents of reality. So we can think of things a little bit backwards, right? Through the contents of reality, we can generalize conclusions on what reality is or is not. But in terms of seeing that code, that truest level of reality, you can't see that from typical perspective. Similarly, reality is like the blank slide on this PowerPoint. You see a white slide and then all of the contents are on top of that white slide. Reality is the contents and the blank slide together. But what we notice are the contents more so than the background, even though both are interdependent and both are manifestations of reality, and you could take those to be both different parts of the same underlying reality. When we try to say that reality is the background and the text, we're still ending up with an insufficient explanation because we are using the contents of what we perceive to make a conclusion about reality. Again, we're looking at a small scope, and once you realize that, you see that reality goes far beyond what you can explain. In short, the takeaway here is that reality just is, right? When we say the where for where is reality, we have it backwards because we're judging reality based on our own perspective. But really what the case is quite the opposite. We are within reality. And when we understand this, then we can start to sort out some of the misunderstandings that we have. If we identify reality from the contents and the small perspectives that we have, we're going to misinterpret things that are always in a state of change as being reality. That, as you can imagine, is bound to lead to psychological suffering and difficulties because we are identifying a sense of permanency with that which by definition is impermanent.